Welcome everybody to the Macquarie University Centre for Reading Public Seminar on Writing Development and Effective Writing Instruction. My name is Danielle Cohen-Brander and I'm the Centre Manager. Before we start, I just want to briefly mention a couple of housekeeping things. Firstly, if you do want to ask questions, please type them into the chat, and if there's time at the end, I'll read out the questions. Secondly, please note that the seminar is being recorded, so if you do type in a question, it will show up in the recording. And a link to the recording will be emailed around after the presentation. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which this university is situated, the Wadawurrung people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Since the Dreamtime, we pay our respects to the Darug people and the Wadawurrung clan. And now I will hand over to the Director of the Macquarie University Reading Clinic, Associate Professor Saskia Conan, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Saskia.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for organising this event. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker, Professor Steve Graham. Steve is an international superpower of spelling and writing research, and it's really quite difficult to do his influence and impact justice. Professor Graham is a Regents and Mary Emily Warner Professor at the Teachers College at Arizona State University, and his work spans 43 years and has investigated how spelling develops, how to teach it effectively, and how to support reading and writing for students with learning difficulties across primary and secondary schools. For those of us working in spelling and writing, we cannot write a paper or research a topic without citing and looking at Steve's excellent work. So many of his works have attracted hundreds of citations. And in addition to that really successful and highly impactful research program, Steve also conducts work that supports the implementation in applied setting. And that's what so many of us on the call today are very interested in as well. So not surprisingly, his list of honors and prizes is so long that it would probably take up the entire hour to read them all out. But let me just say that amongst those many honors, in 2018, Steve was admitted to the Reading Hall of Fame. And so we're very, very grateful that Steve has made the time to talk to us today about writing development and effective writing instruction. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much for such a gracious introduction. I'm going to share with you today what my colleagues and I have been doing, I guess, for a good number of years, as I've mentioned, as Sasha had mentioned. And what I'm going to talk about from the perspective of our research, but it really reflects what we know more broadly through hundreds of researchers who have studied writing and how writing, reading, and learning are connected. And so I'd like to start, well, of course, it's not moving for me now. Give me a second. Here we go. I'd like to start by talking about how writing operates and about how it develops. And I want to make some key points. One of those is that when we think about writing, I think it's really important that we, give consideration to both cognitive and the social contextual aspects of learning to write and how it operates. And in 2018, I developed a model of writing called the Writers Within Community model. And basically what it was meant to do was bridge between cognitive views of writing and social or social cultural views of writing, which in most of the field of writing, and this also operates in the field of reading, you see these things disconnected to a great degree. So I'm going to start with a basic element of this model, and that is writing's complex. And we'll think about this first from the cognitive end and then the social end. And I'll share really briefly some tenets around the model, and then we'll move to some other points. But in terms of thinking about writing being complex, this diagram basically kind of illustrates the cognitive processes involved in writing. So on the one hand, you have production processes over in the right corner where you have to conceptualize your topic and what you're going to write about. And that usually involves goals and sub-goals in various ways. Once you have some sense of what you're going to write about, even if it's just, I know I'm going to write a note to my significant other that I'll be gone to dinner and back at 7, you have to come up with the ideas. You have to translate those into the appropriate sentence vehicle, if you'd like, to convey your ideas. That has to be transcribed into text. And anywhere throughout this process, you may be engaged in reconceptualization. Usually people use the word revising, but I like reconceptualization better because that can happen anywhere. Now, when you are carrying out these production processes, you're often drawing, well, not often, you're almost always drawing upon long-term memory resources. You may be drawing on resources outside of memory, but you have a particular core of knowledge that you're going to bring to that writing task. For example, if you're writing a story, you know what the functions and forms of stories are, and that knowledge helps you in terms of those production processes. You might be writing about a particular topic, and so you're going to have background knowledge on that. You're going to have knowledge of language, that you're going to bring to bear, or if you'd like on transcription skills, knowledge about how words are spelled in English. You also have certain beliefs that drive this process and are related to the control mechanisms above, but how competent you are as a writer, your attitudes towards writing, your intrinsic motives or extrinsic motives or self-regulatory motives, how you value writing. I'm not going to try to detail all of these here, but these long-term memory resources help you in terms of the production processes and serve as a catalyst as well. Now, writing isn't a mindless thing, and so there are control mechanisms involved in this. And when you take a look up here, obviously you've got to devote your attention in particular ways when you're writing, and you have to break off in particular ways. You focus in on this, you break from that, you focus here. But we also have working memory. We bring ideas from long-term memory that we're going to use in the production processes. We have to hold them there, and we bring different cognitive operations in on this. What I really want to point out here is the executive control thing. So think of what I said earlier about conceptualization and intentions. Those are directly linked. Your intentions are your goals. Usually when you have a goal, you have some idea of how you're going to achieve them. And you monitor whether they're successful, and you may react whether they are or not if you're fully engaged in this process of intentions to plans to monitor to react. And then all of this is modulated by the physical state that you're in. So if you're tired, these cognitive processes may not work as well. If you have different personality traits. So if you're somebody who's highly conscientious, you may approach this in a different way than somebody who's less conscientious. And, your emotions play a role here. We see this all the time with kids with special needs we work with. They have an initial reaction to writing, which is often they're angry or they withdraw. It makes them feel sad. And so those particular modulators affect how this cognitive operation works. Now, in addition to that, this doesn't take place in isolation. Writing takes place in communities. And so an easy way of thinking about this is that think about Facebook. If you have your friends on Facebook, or if you have a group of people that you email with or chat, or that you text or Twitter with in various ways, that takes place within a community in which you're sharing your writing and people are sharing with you. They're reading what you write. And if you think about that, if you look at the center of this circle, basically you have goals whenever you're in that community, or there may be goals that the community actually, places upon you, but you engage in various actions and use written tools to create a written product. But that's not done alone in communities. So you see writers and collaborators is the next thing around here. And collaborators can include other writers or people that you write with. They can include the people who read your text. They can include mentors. They can include teachers. But all of this sets in, another circle of things, which includes the purposes of the writing community. So think about this for just a second. If you are taking a class at a university that requires a good deal of writing, when you first start that class, you don't really know what the norms are going to be for that particular instructor, or how those norms are going to be shaped by the community in which you're operating, the other students within the class. So it's a two-way street. You know, you have this purpose where you may have a teacher who has a hierarchical control there, but it doesn't operate just on that level, because it also not only comes top down, but bottoms up in most instances. Members of communities, you know, they may be right proud of being in that community, and they may support its goals and are familiar with them, and they may not be. There's a collective history, if you're in that writing class, that develops across the semester. All of those things influence what happens in terms of what you write and what happens in that learning community or writing community. And then obviously the physical and social environment. And it doesn't have to be physical in the sense of being there where you're in a place. It can be digital, as we are today. Now, what all this means is that, without me kind of beating this to death, is that we suggest that there's 4 tenets here. First, that what you write and you're learning to write is shaped by the community in which you're writing. So if you think about, you know, if you're on an online group, you know, there's different norms for what's acceptable writing versus when you're in an academic setting. But individuals, in terms of the first tenet there, also have the ability to take action on their own. I don't necessarily have to accept, you know, this assignment. I may talk with a teacher and say, can we modify this? Or when I do the assignment, I may take some liberties with it. But I have the ability to change the community and my operation within it. Also, writing is simultaneously shaped by capacity of the community and also the members of the community. So, you know, if a writing community is just starting out, like a classroom, a college classroom, then you don't have a lot of capacity. But as time goes on, it develops more capacity. Or think about a community in which you have digital tools and ones that you don't. So communities with digital tools allow you to do a lot of different things. And it's the same thing in terms of capacity of the writers. You know, that can range from your beliefs or what you know or the skills that you possess. But those all determine what happens in a community and how writing proceeds. Obviously, bearability of both the community in terms of its actions and the individuals within it shape this. And then just by participating in the community, you learn its norms, its rules, its typified ways of being, etc. But at the same time, you affect those, because there's no community in which everybody goes in a lockstep fashion. So I present this to illustrate how complex writing is. It's not just complex because it's a difficult cognitive activity, but it's complex because it sets in multiple communities that differ in various ways, including the norms that they set, the values that they place on writing, their collective history, how they view the individuals that participate in that community, to name a few things. A second point that I'd like to make, and I think this is often overlooked, but we all realize this intuitively: writing is not a single thing. So one way of thinking about this is you ask kids to write a persuasive text, a story, an informational text. You know, let's keep it to those 3. You're not going to see that kids produce the same quality of text in all 3 of those different conditions. Okay, if we threw poetry in there, you may even get more variability. This is not only the case for kids that we think of as good writers, but it's also the case for kids who find writing more challenging. As an example of this, we did a study a few years back with kids with special needs, and we asked them to write 4 compositions, and we were stunned at the variability in terms of the quality of what they wrote across the 4 different types of text. I guess a simple way of thinking about this, some of you are academics. You know, you're like me, you're pretty good at writing a journal article, but you might not be so good at writing poetry. You might not be so good at writing a novel. And you might not be so good at writing something for a physics audience. So writing's not a simple thing. It's not something where you learn a set of skills and all of a sudden you're good across all types and functions of writing. These things develop at different paces and with different growth trajectories over time. And it's very individual. I'd love to be able to say, I know what development writing looks like. What I can say to you is that based on 40 something years of doing this, I don't think writing development's natural. I think it's highly influenced by context and desire and the capabilities that you've picked up, but it's widely different from one function of writing or genre of writing to the next for an individual and across individuals. I don't need to say any more. That's all I've got on this one. Writing is challenging. And, I love this picture when I saw it because it reminded me of how kids sometimes feel, especially kids who find writing particularly difficult about this task. But it's also something that all of us have experienced this. I can tell you I've had days where I spent 8 hours tolling at writing, and I've written one paragraph at the end of 8 hours. Fortunately, that doesn't happen that often, but writing can be quite challenging, even if you're somebody who participates a lot in the activity. I also, before talking a little bit about effective writing instruction, I'd like to say a little bit about the catalysts that drive writing. And I'd love to say that this is my idea, but I wouldn't be truthful if I said that. I'm drawing from Patricia Alexander, who used to be a colleague of mine in human development at University of Maryland. And she has a domain knowledge theory that she postulates that the way that you move from being, let me move back, for some reason we move forward. The way that you move from being a novice to competence to expertise is by changes in a particular domain, in your strategic prowess, and the knowledge that you possess that's pertinent to that domain, and your motivation as it relates to that domain. And I added for writing skills here because there are a number of writing skills that can interfere with strategy, knowledge, and motivation. Now, why do I feel comfortable saying to you, I think these are really powerful catalysts for moving writing forward. So what we've done is we've taken a look at the accumulated evidence, and we've also participated in developing some of this evidence. We posed 3 questions for each of these areas, whether strategy, knowledge, motivation, or skills. And what we've suggested that if these are important contributors, we would expect that more advanced writers possess, say, more knowledge. We'll use knowledge as an example of writing than less advanced writers. And again, that includes all different kinds of knowledge, like I said before, from knowledge of the topic to knowledge of language, to knowledge of the purposes and functions of different kinds of text, from knowledge of spelling, etc. We would expect that individual differences in knowledge, all these various kinds of knowledge, would also be related to predict individual differences in writing performance. And we would also, in the most stringent test of this, is that when we do things, interventions, instruction, or things that help students gain more knowledge, if you'd like, then we would expect to see improvements in writing as well. So you could apply this to more advanced writers or more strategic in terms of how they go about writing than less advanced writers. Or if we take the next down, individual differences in various aspects of motivation, predict individual differences in writing performance, or helping students become better, say, at transcription skills, handwriting, spelling, and typing, leads to improvement in writing. And in this case, when we test that, we look at overall writing quality. And the case is for this is that all of these apply to all 4 of these except motivation. Motivation's been the tricky one. Basically, more advanced writers tend to be better, more motivated than less advanced writers. But one of the things that you see is that there's a lot of fluctuation in motivation for writers. Actually, writing motivation tends to go down the longer students are in school. May have something to do with the kinds of tasks we ask them to write about. However, the end point here is when we do things to increase motivation, we see increased writing performance. So I want to give just kind of a little break here. We do some research where we interview kids about what they know. So I'm very interested in kids' knowledge about writing. So This was from a study with fourth grade students a number of years ago, 1993 to be exact, so quite a while ago. But we asked students various questions. And so some of our more skilled writers in this case, how do you make your writing better? And the kids said things like, make the ending real exciting, put my sentences in different orders. And then we asked kids who we already knew in advance, found writing really challenging. We got things like, make sure I have my date and name on there. And my favorite response of all times, write it bigger so that it takes up more space. Now, there were also a lot of things like making sure the words are spelled correctly, making sure that if the handwriting's neat and things like that. Now, I'm overplaying my hand a little bit here. About 2/3 of the responses by kids who were stronger writers centered on content and process, and about 1/3 centered on these kind of mechanical aspects of writing, production processes. For kids who are struggling writers, it's just the opposite. 2/3 of their comments were things like this and, kind of the mechanical aspects of writing, and 1/3 were on content and process. So I don't want you to walk away thinking that, it's this stark. It's not, but that's still a pretty large difference between the two. Now, like I said, the more salient data on this is what happens when you provide help or instruction or procedures that help students become more strategic, more knowledgeable, more motivated, or improves their writing skills. And so these are some of the things that we see based on meta-analysis that we've conducted. You get huge effect size when you teach kids how to be more strategic in terms of planning and revising, teaching them specific strategies to use to help them, say, plan a persuasive text or a story or revise text in various ways, a full standard deviation and so. When you help students become more knowledgeable by increasing something like genre knowledge or the vocabulary, the effects range from about 1/3 of a standard deviation to about 3/4 of a standard deviation. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence on motivation from the meta-analysis we've conducted to date, but when you put in place activities designed to increase motivation, you get an effect size of around a full standard deviation. And these all are on writing quality, where the jump is. And then for writing skills, when you teach handwriting, spelling, and typing, half a standard deviation improvement in writing quality. So these things are interfering with other writing processes. That's why writing quality gets better. And when you help kids become more facile and fluent, you're never going to become automatic. And you don't want to in sentence construction because it's a thinking activity. You get about a half a standard deviation jump in writing quality. I think this is the strongest evidence to say, okay, if we want to move kids forward as writers, what is it we need to pay attention to? We need to help them become more strategic, more knowledgeable, particularly about the functions and building blocks of writing. We want to increase and help them become more motivated. And I think particularly important here is efficacy for writing. And we want to make sure that these kind of foundational skills are not getting in the way. Now, I'm going to shift, and anytime I shift, you're going to see these glasses come up. So I kind of had a lead into here. We've done to date somewhere around 20 meta-analysis, taking a look at writing or writing and reading and writing and learning. So what is it that we've learned in a basic sense about these? So I'm going to bring this down to one word for each of the things we've learned and then expand upon that a little bit. So one of the things that we found is that if you want to help students move forward as writers, one of the essential things you have to do, kids have to write. That's the game, right? It doesn't matter what else you do. If they're not writing, then they're not in the game. And so I didn't put up the effect sizes that you'd get here. You don't get a huge effect size here for having kids write, say, in grades 1 to 6. It's about 1/4 of a standard deviation. But when you have kids, say, increase their writing by about 45 minutes per week, what you see also is that reading comprehension on norm reference standardized test improves about 1/4 of a standard deviation as well. That's a hard thing to move. Norm reference standardized test and 1/4 of a standard deviation jump. You get a twofer here. That's the best situation in the world. Now, to be frank, what I can't tell you is we don't know right yet. We just don't have the evidence to know what happens with middle and high school students on this. But what we do know is in almost everything else that we look at, where we have really nice jumps, kids are writing as they're learning particular skills or tools that will help them be better writers. So I really don't want to see these two disconnected. Now, there's a couple of other things here, and two of these I'm going to say are not evidence-based, but I think they're important. So one is, as much as possible, we want kids writing for real purposes. So I remember one time being in a classroom and kids were writing a letter. And I thought, oh, that's great. They're doing something for a real purpose. And I asked the teacher, who are they writing the letter for? They weren't. They were practicing letter writing. And I thought, you're not going to put as much into this. You're not going to be as motivated to write if it doesn't have an authentic audience, if it doesn't have a real purpose. So we want to make that happen as much as possible. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is when you're using writing as a tool for learning, which I'll talk about later, that's a real purpose, okay? It doesn't have to have an audience beyond yourself. So I don't want to give you the idea that it's always got to be something read by somebody else. It doesn't. It just needs to have a functional purpose, and when it's being written for somebody else, an audience. We also want kids to write for different purposes. We want them trying out different genres, if you'd like, different functions of writing. We want them to be in there practicing, have their hand in. And one of the things that Kellogg mentioned a number of years ago, and I think he made a good case for this, and I think this applies across domains, whether we're talking about reading or writing, practice is important. One of the ways that you get better as a reader is by reading. One of the ways that you get better as a writer is by writing. And if you only do something once, then you're not going to get appreciably better at it. If we want students to write better persuasive text, they need to be doing this relatively frequently. And then what we do know is that if we engage in a process-oriented approach to writing, students' writing does get better. There's considerable evidence on this. One of the things that I caution here a little bit on this is sometimes we get a little too slap happy, so to speak, with the process approach. There's sometimes when I need to plan in advance, and there's sometimes when I don't. So not everything that I write needs to follow this kind of lockstep process: plan, draft, revise, edit, and share. In fact, we need to do a better job of making this process look more like it does in real life for real writers, where they shift back and forth between these processes. A second thing that's particularly important, and I can't speak as directly to Australia as I can to the US, but we've been at this battle forever in literacy about teaching. Some people seeing teaching as a dirty word. Some people seeing it as the most important thing in the world. And I fall somewhere in the middle. I don't see teaching as a dirty word. I think it's essential. On the other hand, I think it has to be balanced off by other things we do, like having kids write, because there's no real reason to learn these things if they're not doing that. But here's what we know at this point. When you teach students strategies for planning and revising, remember that effect size I showed you before, 1.26, you get a huge effect on writing quality. And, not surprising, kids plan more. Their revising looks better if you teach them how to do this. And these are skills that they need, throughout life. When we teach kids how to construct sentences, like more complex sentences through things like sentence combining, where we model how to combine kernel sentences into more complex sentences, students practice it, they apply it in their writing. We teach them how to construct, basic rudimentary paragraphs. And you notice grammar's in red, so I'll come back to that in a second, but at least the first two, we get positive effects. And I will say this for both of these two things. This is for kids in general and kids with special needs. Both of these first two are very powerful for each of those. Now, the reason grammar's in red is the last time that we've done meta-analysis looking at this, grammar didn't have a positive effect as it was being taught in research studies. And basically, when you think about it, it's not a surprise. So what you basically saw for grammar is that Let's say something like an adjective, which describes a person, place, or thing. It would be described, kids would be given the definition of adjectives, and then they'd practice generating adjectives to go in slots in a sentence written in a workbook. Or there might be 3 adjectives that they pick the right one from. Now, there's 2 problems with that if we just focus in on this example. One is that you probably would get better results if students help construct the definition of what an adjective is. And that's not hard to help kids do. And second, we need to model how to do this, and we need to have them think about how to apply it. Mark Twain, one of the great American writers, once said, if you catch an adjective, kill it. Well, what he was talking about is some writers have the tendency to be overly descriptive. And so, you want, as a writer, as you gain these skills, you want to think about their application. So modeling how to use it, having kids do this and talk about it, where it works, where it doesn't, and then applying it in their own writing, I think is a much more powerful way of doing this. We're involved in 2 very large meta-analyses now, involving somewhere around 800 studies. So I'm hoping I can take grammar out of the red the next time I talk about this a year from now. We know that if we teach handwriting, spelling, and typing, as I mentioned before, especially in the first 3 grades, 6 to about 9 years of age, students' overall writing gets better. We don't have a lot of studies on this, and it's really weird because there's all kinds of studies in reading on vocabulary instruction. But when we do teach vocabulary instruction, for example, helping kids think about the words they might use when they're writing a story about outer space, or even something like if they're writing a mystery, bringing in vocabulary like red herring and other words that convey not only meaning in and of themselves, but provide some information about the genre. Those things have a positive effect on students' writing. And when we help students acquire knowledge about the purpose and structure of different types of text, usually by reading text and talking about those purposes and functions, we get a positive effect on writing quality. Now, in addition to writing and teaching, we want to be sure that we provide students with support as they write. Okay, so these are 4 things that all have been effective. In the research literature, there's others, but given the time, I want to be cognizant of that. Probably the easiest thing that you can do, given the amount of time it takes, is set clear and specific goals for what you want your students to do, okay? If you don't, students are going to ask you because they're smart. You give them this ill-defined writing assignment, I guarantee you somebody's going to ask, especially if it's like a college, well, how many pages? How many references? What they're doing is they're forcing you into a means-ends analysis. Since you're not telling them what you want, they ask questions to get at what you want. So think through what you want and be clear about what that is. Now, the downside to that is that things then start to look like what you asked for. And so you want to be sure that some of your writing isn't always so directed that you're saying, I want X, Y, and Z. When we engage kids in pre-writing activity, whether it's reading text before, dialogue about the text, dialogue about what they're going to write about, or using a graphic organizer to help them generate ideas and organize them, we get a positive effect on writing. When we have peers work together around process, planning together, writing together, giving each other feedback on what they're doing, editing together, we get a really strong positive effect. But I will warn you on this, is that just throwing kids together to do this doesn't work well. These studies all taught kids a system or a strategy for planning together, for giving feedback, etc. So it has to be well thought out. And then when we involve kids in inquiry, where they're investigating a topic, gathering information, thinking about it, organizing it, talking about it, looking at data, not surprising if they're going to write about it, their writing's going to be better because they have more to say. They have richer knowledge to draw upon, and they've thought about it. And so any of those kinds of things are a prelude to bringing those ideas together in writing. We also want to be sure that we assess. And so here's what we know. When teachers give feedback, positive things happen. I'm going to say something a little bit more off the cuff on this in a second. When peers give feedback and it's structured, like I said before, peers working together, positive effect on writing quality. when we teach kids how to evaluate their own writing with very specific procedures of positive feedback, and we're starting to find about a third of a standard deviation jump in writing quality when computers give feedback. Now, I will say to you, this is the future of staring you at the bottom of the page here. What's going to happen in the future is computers, and right now computers are our colleagues when we write. They give us feedback on, spelling. They might provide help in terms of grammar. We have what I would call word processing plus programs, which I'll mention in a minute, that might help you plan something, that might give you this kind of evaluative feedback. The effects of those kinds of programs are much larger than word processing alone, as a prelude to what I was going to say. Now, there are a couple of things I'd like to say off the cuff on feedback. One is our tendency is not to tell people what's good about what kids write. You want them to do something again, tell them what you like. Tell them what you like first before you give them the constructive feedback. Make sure you get a number, a reasonable number of positive insights in there first. Also, we act like we have to change the world on everything that students write. What we want to always think about is that this is a process of moving forward incrementally. So I might give feedback on 3 things, for a student, and not 25 things, or red mark a paper to death. I can tell you from personal experience that I've experienced, I'm sure many of you have too. I just don't, I ignore that kind of feedback. If I get too much of it, I can't handle it. It's too much. And for developing writers, it's particularly the case. So we want to think about this as an incremental movement forward. And then one other thing I'd say on this is we act brain dead when we're giving feedback. We give feedback on a piece of writing last week and we don't remember what we said. And then when we get feedback the next week, we have this opportunity to say, oh, I love this. I'd said something about this last week, and look, you've done this in this paper here. And I can look for ways of reinforcing things I've given feedback on in the past, and I can connect my feedback over at least 2 or 3 papers, which I think will make it more powerful. Now, in addition, and I've already said a good bit about this, when we have kids write on word processors over time versus just by hand, there's about a half a standard deviation jump in writing quality. When we use these plus programs that have things that help you plan, help you evaluate, put it within a game format for learning, the effects are almost 3 times what they are with word processing alone. And think about your smartphone now. Speech to text, how much composing do you do on your smartphone? These tools are increasingly going to be part of our writing landscape, both outside of school and in school, and they require that we rethink how we provide writing instruction. Speech to text is a good example of this. We tend to act extemporaneously. We say whatever's on top of our head. Well, that may be good for a conversation. That may be good for some kinds of writing, but it's not great for others. So planning becomes particularly important. And in fact, excellent dictators, people who used to use dictaphones in the 1950s, a really interesting study was done with people who were really great at this. They spent 60% of their composing time planning before operating the dictaphone to make sure that they were clear and their message was in an organized format. We think we're clear and organized when we speak, but maybe not so much. Have somebody interview you sometime and find out what happens when you go back to read it. We also want to connect writing to reading and learning. So let me put this really straightforward. What we know at this point is that if we ask students to write about things they're reading, their comprehension improves. When we increase how much students write, reading comprehension, over time, reading comprehension improves. When we teach writing skills like spelling, text structure, sentence combining, various aspects of reading improves. It works the other way. When we have kids read more, they become better writers over time. When we teach phonological awareness, phonics, text structure as part of reading instruction as examples, their writing becomes better. When we combine reading and writing instruction so that they share about an equal amount of time, 60-40, reading and writing become better. We do not take adequate advantage of the connections that exist between reading and writing. It's been a missed opportunity for us. Another thing that I'd like to point out is obviously if you write about what you read, okay, you're going to understand it. Well, the same thing happens if you write about what you're learning in class, whether it's presented orally or in film or in other fashions. There's about a third of standard deviation jump in your understanding of that material and also in your remembrance of it. So we need to look to make reading and writing a part of learning across the curriculum that increases how much students write, which is a good thing for writing, because you'll see in a second, we're not seeing a lot of that, either in countries like the US, Australia, or countries worldwide, but it provides a way of leveraging learning as an influence on writing and reading and writing as an influence on each other and learning in turn. And I think this is an area that we really want to be working on as we move into the future, the next 10 years. Another thing I think is very important, I don't know any other skill like this. I got a rejection today in the mail. I mean, it was a sound rejection on a meta-analysis, which I don't think I've ever gotten on a meta-analysis, because you can always work on a meta-analysis. I won't read the reviews for a week. I won't be able to bear reading them for at least a week. And so, I feel like I'm in a hostile environment with these reviews right now. But, writing is kind of a personal thing for people. And so we want to be sure, because you're putting yourself out there. When you write a story, you don't want people to say, I didn't like it. You really want people to like it. It's putting part of your personal self out to view for the public and comment on it. So one of the things is we want to create an environment where students are free to take risks. So remember, I was talking about sentence construction before. If you've got a kid who's 12 or 13, you're teaching a more complex sentence. His road to mastery is going to involve, or hers is going to involve, miscues in using that more complex sentence. They're going to make errors, if you'd like, or miscues, if you'd like, as they start to apply this before they master it. So if they can't take risks for that, then it's going to it's not going to help stimulate their mastery of more complex sentence use. They need to be sure that their efforts are appreciated and that writing is valued. So what are some of the things? And I'm not drawing this from empirical studies. I'm drawing it from the study of exceptional teachers with qualitative studies where we've gone through them and we've looked at the themes that occur of what teachers who are really exceptional in their literacy classes do. And here's some of the things that we found. They often participate as members of the writing community. They're writers themselves. They don't have to be the best writer in the world. Kids don't know that. They just like it when their teacher shares writing with them. One of my daughter's best teachers misspelled about 1 out of every 5 words. Kids never really noticed. Parents noticed, but the kids really didn't. Occasionally, and notice I'm saying occasionally, not always, we want to give students choice. Choice is important. There's not a lot of evidence that it makes a difference. It's really complex, but I do think it's an important part of becoming a motivated and self-directed writer. We want to praise students' efforts and accomplishment. As I mentioned before, write for real purpose. We want to make their writing visible. Now, that's different if you're young kids or older kids, but we want to have real audiences. We want to display it. We want to make it part of something. We want to set realistic and challenging goals. I think of this as pushing the envelope. We want to push it a little bit. Remember that incremental thing I talked about. And we don't want to push it so far that kids can't be successful. We also want to create a positive classroom where we expect that our kids will try hard and we believe that they will be successful. And we want to attribute success to effort and the tactics they were learning. I think this last part is particularly important. You're a good writer not because you're smart or you know a lot. You're a good writer because you work hard and you basically are using the tools that you've learned in this classroom. We want to develop classroom routines where kids share what they write with their peers and promote positive interactions. We want to allow kids to adapt what assignments we give them. If I had a kid come to me and I gave an assignment and said, I'd like to do a spinoff on this, the immediate thing I would do is say yes. And we want to connect writing in and out of school. Now, real briefly, we've if you'd like, we have 8,000 or more teachers that have responded to surveys that we've done. We're in the process of doing a number of observation studies, and we've done these in the US, Greater China, Chile, Norway, and then there are other people that we brought their information in. Here's what we basically know about writing instruction around the world. And there's 2 surveys that have been done in Australia, and they're not very different from this. A small minority of teachers devote a considerable amount of time to teaching writing, and they have really, you'd love to have your kid in their writing classroom. Most teachers devote little time to teaching writing. And, even with that said, they apply a lot of different writing procedures. So they know how to do different things. We just don't see a lot of time spent teaching writing or having kids write. And the most common kinds of writings are things like filling in the blank, writing short answers to questions like on homework assignments, etc. One of the key contributors to this probably is college preparation. Even English teachers in the US, who are basically studying English and teach English, 72% in one study, a random sample from across the US, said their college composition instruction was inadequate. And so we see usually upwards 50, 60, 70% of teachers saying the same thing. There's a lot of beliefs. If you feel that if you like to teach writing, if you feel that you're efficacious at teaching it, then you're more likely to teach it. One thing I will say, doesn't seem to matter too much if you think you're a good writer. That seems to be not very well correlated with what you do in the classroom. So what can we do? This is the end point. And this, I'm going to go big and go broad here. I think if we're going to change what writing instruction looks like, not only in the US or Australia, but across the world, we have to think big picture. It's got to become a public priority. This was illustrated with reading in the US and say adolescent students. Nobody taught reading to adolescent students 25 years ago in the US. Now most teachers, it's part of their program. And that's because it became a public priority. Different agencies took this on and really pushed it with people in Congress, at the national level and at the state level. We want to make sure that school administrators and state level education policymakers know why writing is invaluable to kids, not only in terms of the value of writing itself, but its role in terms of improving reading and writing. We want to reimagine how schools provide writing instruction. This needs to be something that occurs across the curriculum. We have evidence that if you have kids write about science, math, or social studies, it makes a difference in their learning. We need to provide adequate time for writing and writing instruction. And this includes providing extra time and assistance for kids who find this skill particularly challenging. And the earlier that occurs, just like in reading, the better. We want to make sure teachers are adequately prepared. We've really let teachers down on this. I feel that the academy or the universities are unreliable partners in our efforts to help kids become better writers and teachers to become better teachers. And we want to expand the goal of writing. We have this kind of focus in on giving tests and looking to see how students write. Yeah, I want kids to be good writers, but I want them to be motivated writers. And so part of our issue here is not only tracking the progress of their writing skills, but also making it a priority that they view themselves as good writers, that they like to write, that they're intrinsically motivated. Motivation, in my opinion, needs to become a broader part of this picture. And we need to do a better job of connecting writing done at school at home. And finally, all I've talked about is writing. I love this from a 7-year-old girl. There's obviously more in the universe than what I talked about. The 7-year-old talks about a good teacher, loves her kids, helps you out, always has a smile, is fair with her kids, full of surprises, likes to laugh, tries her best, listens to her heart. This is the kind of teacher that we all want for our own kids. It's the kind of teacher hopefully you have when you were in school as well. But it just brings back the point. Your skill level in terms of teaching in a domain is part of this, but there's much more than that as well. So I think we have a little bit of time left for questions or pushback, and I'm always fine with pushback as well.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that wonderful talk. So much of it really rang true for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people who were listening. So everybody, if you have questions, please type them into the chat and I'll read them out. And while everyone's typing, I just want to say one thing that really jumped out to me is when you were talking about revision, because I think when I'm working with children, I'm usually working on reading, but when I'm working with undergraduates, I'm often talking about writing, and they always have this impression that it's a one-shot thing, that you just kind of write and it's finished. But revision is so important and so much a part of the process, and I don't think that that's emphasized very much in the education system, as far as I'm aware.
No, I can tell you when we asked this question, at least in the US in surveys from grades 1 to 12, we actually don't see a lot of emphasis on either planning or revision, which is kind of surprising. We don't see it in terms of teaching, and we don't see it when we ask teachers how much time is spent on it. Teachers conference with kids, they give feedback, but there's not a lot of time, at least in class, devoted to this. The other thing I would say about this is that there's some evidence that, if you just leave kids to their own devices on revision, you don't start seeing much change until they're in, somewhere around 14, 15, 16 years of age. But we also have evidence that if you work with them, help them evaluate their own writing, or help them learn how to deal with feedback from peers or teachers, that revising gets better and has a positive effect on what students write. But this is one of those things that you don't automatically become it's not an art, so to speak. It's a learned skill.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that there's not, up on the high ends of writing, that there's not art involved. But I think in terms of this movement from being a novice to competence, I prefer to think of it as a skill kind of thing, something you can learn, something anyone can learn.
Okay, well, I can see we've got quite a few questions here, so I'm going to start with the first one from Genevieve MacArthur. Thank you for such a clear and interesting presentation, Professor Graham. I really appreciate how much work you've put into so many systematic reviews to guide our thinking. I understand that the evidence for motivation is not as strong as other areas. However, if you had to guess a top motivator for writing, or the first thing someone might like to try, would it be getting kids to practice their writing in a real life way that would achieve real life outcomes for them, or something more subtle or entirely different?
Well, I would never go against the example just given. I think that's a very powerful motivator. If it's something that kids see has a real purpose, then they're more likely, not everybody, anytime I say anything here, it's never going to apply to everyone, but they're much more likely to be engaged, and they're much more likely to put effort into it and persist. But I'll mention another thing that I think is very important. In our own work, one of the things that we do is that we have students assess their own writing. Now, sometimes it's the use of something we're teaching, or sometimes it's something they're writing, but we give them particular tools for doing that. But we also set up the situation so that they see success. So I think efficacy is particularly important. So for example, if I was teaching students a simple, say, kids who are 7 or 8 years of age, I might ask them before they write, think about, which side they want to put their marbles on. So, and then generate some possible reasons that would support it, make some decisions about what they think are the most convincing ones for the reader, and maybe do a little thinking about how they're going to write this up as a general guide to what they're going to do when they first do it the first time. I'm going to have them write something opinion before. We won't look at it right at that point. But then the first time they do this, we're going to do it together. So they're going to be successful. And so then we'll compare what they did on the first time to the second time after they evaluate both. Then the next time we do it, I'll be doing it with them, but I'm turning over more control to them. And then once I feel comfortable, then they'll be doing it with a peer, and then they'll do it themselves. So you're going to see, in comparison to where they were, a steady point. And then what we do when we conference with them is we gush about what they've done without trying to go overboard. But we talk about, we ask them, why do you think you're doing so well? And it doesn't really matter what they're saying. We're going to bring that conversation back around to working hard and to using what you've learned. And so we found that has increased self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is a powerful motivator in terms of whether you're willing to do things. If you feel efficacious to do it, you're more likely to do it. You're more likely to engage in it. You're more likely to persist. You're more likely to put effort into it. So both of those, that and something that's real, I think really makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So next question. I work with students with many, this is from Kristen Anthony, I work with students with complex learning needs, and many students come to me with absolute disengagement to write. Top tips to get them starting to see themselves as writers. So I guess this is related to the previous question then.
Yeah, no, this is a really challenging question. I mean, I was a special education teacher, so I worked with a lot of kids with learning differences, emotional behavioral difficulties, and except for the last 10 years, I've always been in the Department of Special Education and prepared teachers to work with kids with special needs. So I would love to say I've never seen this before, but I've seen it more often than I'd like. I'll tell you a couple of things here that have worked, not with every kid, but have worked for us. One is sometimes kids come to this task, and one of the reasons they shut down is that transcription skills are so difficult for them, so slow and time consuming, that they know that they can produce more, but when they write, they do 6 words or a line or 2 lines and they stop. So one of the things that we've done is we have kids, if they're older kids, use speech to text synthesis to get ideas down, like in a free writing thing, or younger kids onto a tape recorder. Another thing we've done is we've had kids plan something to write to begin with, where they've done the planning with a tape recorder. So what we try to do is circumvent what might be one of the possible causes for why they're not doing this. The other thing that we try to get a handle on is we often try to look for something the kid's interested in. And so I did this in a clinic I used to work at before I was a university professor. Is if I had a kid who really loved pirates, for example, a 5th grade boy, then I'd bring stuff in, we'd read about pirates, and then I'd look for something small for him to respond to. Not a big piece, but a small piece that would be pretty straightforward. And I might write out part of the response if need be, and they'd write up, but I'd start pulling back on what I did, and I would start increasing what I'd ask for with sensitivity to trying to be aware of how far I could go, and kind of pushing that envelope out a little bit. Now, that's a lot easier to do when you're working one-on-one or one-on-2 or one-on-3 with kids. It becomes much more complicated if you have a kid in class, as in the case. So the other thing that I like to do, if kids are writing a little bit, and I give an assignment, and I mentioned this before, I will likely have different goals for different kids. Not that I'm blabbering that out to everybody in the class, but for some of my high flyers, they may have much more challenging goals for some aspect of what they're writing. And I may have other kids where, you can change this assignment and we can think of something else that you do. Or I may give them 3 choices and they have to choose. But I want to keep them engaged in the game. And so it requires thinking pretty carefully about how to do that.
Thank you. So I can just see that we have a lot of questions, and also that it's already 11 o'clock here. So I think we might have to do just one final question. So I'm very sorry about the other questions. I can see that there's so many there. I can see that a couple of them are about specific references for some of the papers. So perhaps, Steve, if I could ask you for some of those references, and then I can email those out to the
yeah, I'd be glad to that. And I'm going to give you my email address as well. It was at the front of this, but people can always email me. It's Steve, STV, .graham, GRAHAM, at ASU.edu.
I'll just put
now
that.
we're coming on a vacation. We're coming on a holiday on the 4th of July, and in Flagstaff, Arizona right now, where I try to spend the summer out of the Phoenix heat. but I'm headed back to Phoenix in a day. So if I don't respond till sometime next week, please know that I'm on holiday and I'm traveling.
Thank you so much. So I think I will just do this last question, if that's okay, because I think that there are a couple of people who asked about this. What about writing instruction for children learning English as an additional language?
This is a real challenge. From a research perspective, we don't know much, okay? We just don't have a lot of people looking at this. Some of the things that we can say is that, and this gets a little tricky, we found this out when we moved to Arizona, because you have a large number of kids in school who first language is not English, it's Spanish. And we have other languages, obviously, but Spanish predominates. And we'd make an assumption that kids would be reasonably fluent in Spanish and maybe have literacy skills in Spanish. And one of the things we found out in the first study we conducted in the Phoenix area was that was not the case for about a third to a half of the kids we were working with. So one of the things that you sometimes can do is take advantage of the skills that they've got in their first language, or their first language in terms of writing, to use those as a bridge over to English. And that becomes more challenging when, the bridge isn't as strong, the piles on one side are not as strong as you anticipated that they would be. But I do think, and I'm going to say this off the cuff, that one of the things is that we do want to allow them, as they're initially writing, to be able to switch back and forth between languages. I think the most important thing initially is getting text on page, words on page, so to speak. And if that means that some of that is in Spanish or in another language, and some of it is in English, or if it starts off in another language completely, we'll be moving towards that. There are some skills that I think cut across language. Teaching how to, well, I should say, let me back up on this. There are some processes that generally cut across, but as soon as it was out of my mouth, I realized, boy, I better back up on that. So think about, you guys are close to China. China has traditionally, when you write a argument or a persuasive thing, you don't state the argument directly historically in China. You may not state it at all. You work around it. There's all these kind of things that historically have been put together for putting forth an argument without really making it sound like an argument, and without directly stating it in an explicit way like we do in the West. And so one of the things that you may have to grapple with in terms of thinking about this, depending upon the forms and functions that writing plays in the different cultures that your students come from, is we may have to take that into account. But general things like planning, revising, transcribing, handwriting and spelling, although handwriting more so, or typing, these are things that cut across. And so, we want to make sure that students have those skills as well, regardless of which language they're writing in. I think discussion becomes an important thing before writing as well, to the degree that we can do that. So, it can be a little challenging. If you have a teacher who teaches who can speak more than one language, then it becomes a little bit easier in classrooms. Now, I want to mention something else. I told you I had an article rejected recently. It was a meta-analysis on reading instruction for what I will term as emerging bilingual students or English language learners. You know what the average effect size on all reading measures were? 0.18, less than 1/5 of a standard deviation. So I would say that we don't have a really good clue on this in writing or reading, but it's even worse in writing and reading. So I feel like I've let you down on this last question, but I gave it my best.
Thank you. So, that definitely highlights areas where much more research is needed. So I'm going to stop there because we've already gone over time. I think we could all sit and listen to you answer our questions for 3 hours, but I know you don't have that sort of time. So thank you so much again for your talk. It was fantastic. And I'll make the recording available in a couple of days to everybody.
And thank you for inviting me. And you guys, it's your morning time, right?
Yes.
So have a good afternoon. Take care. Okay.
Good evening.
Okay, bye.